friend. Welcome back to the Care Collective podcast, a space where we have honest conversations about the emotional realities behind caregiving, grief, aging, identity, burnout. Maybe you're taking care of someone with a terminal illness and, just what it means to support others without losing yourself in the process. Whether you're caring for a parent, spouse, child, patient, client, or maybe you're just trying to navigate the complicated emotions that come from loving people through hard seasons. I'm really glad you're here. I'm your host, Mikayla, and today's episode is one that if I'm being honest, I have gone back and forth on recording it or, whether it's too controversial to talk about, just because I think that there's a lot of nuance to this kind of topic. It's emotional, it's uncomfortable for so many people. And again, I'm going to put a disclaimer that I'm not trying to, blame people. I'm not trying to judge people at all. And I want to come into this conversation with a really open mind and from a lens of how can we better work together with the people that we are taking care of, okay? So what I want to talk about, I think especially a lot of younger caregivers feel this. I speak from my own experience on this, and I don't think people talk about it very openly, and I want to talk about when you care for somebody and you don't agree with their beliefs, and maybe they make comments that you think are racist or homophobic or sexist or just harsh and judgmental. And maybe they come from a generation with very different beliefs, language, and views of the world than yours, but you're still the one that has to help them get dressed and help them eat and hold their hands during hard moments and show up for them every single day. And emotionally, it can just feel frustrating because, why should you have to help somebody who, in your perspective, is bad, is wrong, is just maybe it's even contrary to what you believe in? I've heard stories of, maybe an elderly person that has a hard time being around Black people and they have a Black caregiver that has to stand there and hear these comments sometimes, right? Or maybe they are very homophobic and that is something that affects you as an individual, the comments that they're making, right? That is so hard. And I want to first just applaud you for still showing up every single day, no matter what is going on, because again, that is so hard to still show up and be kind to somebody that goes completely against your beliefs. And I think that there's nothing more trying in life and nothing that will build your patience more than doing that. Because caregiving is already physically exhausting, but when you almost feel like you're having to go to war every single day mentally and emotionally, it's just a whole different level of things going on. And so I wanted to talk about that today. Again, not from a place of anger or trying to be judgmental, but just how can we have productive ways to navigate these situations? Because I think that's the reality of it. I experienced that myself when I was working in care, that I'm not going to go into the specifics of it because, it's something that I want to respect the privacy of people, but even family members that were kind of like, okay, sorry if this is going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? But the more time I spent in care and around people, you really come to understand that if somebody is just watching Fox News on the TV all day, or they're only watching CNN on the news all day long, that is their world. That is where they're getting their perspective. If anybody watched only the news all day long, that your worldview would be very, very skewed for what is going on, right? And so you kind of have to learn how to balance compassion, things that you can do. Anyways, we're going to get into all the messy parts of it. Because I think when I first started caregiving, I kind of had this very simplified view of what it would be like. I figured, okay, the hardest part's going to be like the physical labor or having to learn how to do these specific things for a person, or what if they were to fall, like what am I supposed to do, right? And yes, those things are hard, but I really think some of those hardest moments have nothing to do with the medicine. It's all the emotions behind it, and it's realizing that the people you are taking care of are still people, that they have all these different experiences that I have not experienced as somebody who is 25 years old. The experiences of somebody who is 50, 60, 70, 80 is going to be so different, right? Because they experience so many different cultures, different wars, different media environments. Even just understanding like people that lived through the Great Depression, they talked about some of the effects that had on people coming out of that for a lifetime, right? So imagine some of these other things that people have been through and kind of the effects it's going to have on them. And some of them are going to have lived through segregation or wars or raised in environments where survival matters more than emotional intelligence. Some people never were given the space to process emotion safely. They were taught to just be a man and shove it in a corner and don't talk about it. Some were never exposed to diversity in the same way that maybe you have been. It's just different. Maybe they grew up in a very rural city in an area where there wasn't that much diversity, right? And again, I want to be very clear that I don't think that this excuses harmful behavior, but I think it does add some context and a little bit of space to give empathy in these situations, because caregiving forces you to sit in that tension between compassion and discomfort at the same time. And that is, like I said, one of the hardest things I think you will ever have to do. And there are moments in care where someone would say something that would genuinely shock me, that I would kind of be like, wait, you can say that? What? And for other context about myself too, like I live in South Carolina, so conversations around race and different things, like I am no stranger to it. I have seen in my own family just wild things and how people have kind of had to work on their beliefs and, things over time. So I'm no stranger to this. I'm very familiar with these kind of things. But still in this moment, I'm thinking like, do I correct this? Am I supposed to ignore this? Do they understand what they're saying right now? Or, maybe is this the dementia and confusion? Is this actually what they believe? Like, it felt so weird. And time again when it would happen, I just kind of felt more weird to not say anything over time. And there were times that I would try to say something and then it would just turn into an argument, and it was not very conductive, even though I feel like I tried to, in my perspective, tried to be very passive in the way that I would try to correct things that they would say, right? And I think society sometimes unintentionally expects caregivers to be emotionally superhuman. Like if you choose care work, you should automatically absorb everything that happens without any kind of reaction. But unfortunately, that's not real, because you are a human being just as much as the person you're caring for is a human being with real emotions, right? And I think younger caregivers especially feel isolated in this experience, because many are entering caregiving from generations that talk more openly about identity and inclusion and trauma and mental health, whether by their own parents raising them that way, or maybe they have inadvertently done the work themselves to, educate themselves on these things and to do better, right? Meanwhile, the older adults they care for may have been raised in environments where these conversations just didn't happen, or they were straight up discouraged from happening, right? Research actually shows that generational differences can deeply affect communication styles, values, and emotional expression. You know how everybody hates on Gen Z at the moment. Gen Z will make jokes about boomers, like it goes both ways, right? Older generations often grew up in environments where authority, stoicism, and traditional social roles were really emphasized, while younger generations tend to prioritize emotional openness, inclusivity, and identity expression. And when those worlds collide inside caregiving, it can create emotional friction. And I also want to say something important here, that sometimes these comments are connected to a cognitive decline. Dementia can affect impulse control, emotional regulation, confusion, and social filtering. Families and caregivers often witness personality shifts, aggression, paranoia, or inappropriate comments that may not fully reflect who the person once was. And that makes things even more emotionally complicated, because then grief gets layered in too, and you start wondering, like, would they have said this 10 years ago? Like, do I actually know who this person is, or is this just the disease talking? And sometimes there just really won't be clear answers for this either way. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind here is that compassion is not the same thing as agreement, and you can still care for somebody without agreeing with everything that they say, and it doesn't have to be a direct reflection of who you are as a person by who you are taking care of. Because you can care for someone's humanity without agreeing with every single belief that they hold, right? You can treat someone with dignity while still protecting your own emotional well-being. You are just one of the strongest people in the world if you can still care for somebody and feel that kind of attack on yourself and your beliefs, right? So I think caregivers sometimes struggle because they think that compassion means erasing themselves if you're just not going to say something in that moment, right? But it doesn't. You're allowed to have emotional reactions. You're allowed to feel uncomfortable. You're allowed to step away and decompress after hard interactions, because caregiving does not make you less human. So, if these things happen, a few things that I would recommend. For one, absolutely have a friend that you can call up and say, like, this just happened. This was kind of crazy. Not from a place of gossiping. Like, that's not what I'm trying to encourage, but just from a place of like having somebody to vent to and somebody that can validate, hey, like what you just experienced was crazy. I'm sorry that you had to feel that way, if nothing else. And if you don't have that person, be that person for yourself and remind yourself that these things happen, right? Another thing is just make sure you have an outlet that you can, remind yourself that this does not need to take up your whole world, whether that is going for a walk. We talk all the time about different forms of self-care. Like, please, please, please find what your form of self-care is throughout all of this, right? And then the last thing I want to kind of tell you as well, too, and things that you can do to kind of feel like you have more control is maybe find, some kind of way to involve yourself in doing good in an area that's stressing you out. So, like I said, I grew up in the South, and I feel like everybody knows that race relations can be really tense in this area, right? Personally, I'm a history buff. I love knowing history and different things that happened. I even spent some time volunteering in the African American Museum in Charleston. It's a beautiful museum. Please absolutely go and see it. I think they have done a wonderful job with educating on the reality of things that happen in Charleston that a lot of other historical sites you would tour do not necessarily talk about. So, that was one way when I was kind of dealing with these situations in care where people would say super racist things. It was nice to be able to go and feel like I was doing good in my community and being able to actively help people and educate on these topics that are really important, right? To hopefully come from a place of empathy and inclusion, so no matter what it is that you can do, just find organizations or things that you can be a part of that feel like you're doing good in the community, whether it's doing Meals on Wheels, maybe you want to go volunteer in an animal shelter, right? I know you're already very giving, and so I'm not trying to throw another thing on your plate, but I think there really is value in being able to show up and give back in these spaces that you are particularly passionate about to be able to make a difference in the world. But I also want to acknowledge too that I think that a lot of elderly people are struggling too in different ways, and not because their beliefs are okay, but because the world has changed so fast. Technology changed, language changed, social expectations changed, family structures changed, communication changed. And for many older adults, there's often a fear underneath some of that resistance. So fear of irrelevance. Maybe they're scared to make a joke around you because they don't know if you're going to find that it's funny anymore, right? Maybe they fear losing control. They already can't drive anymore, and that's really hard for them, and they just don't want to keep letting go of things in their life. And ultimately, I think it creates this fear of no longer understanding the world around them. And so, sometimes when they're saying these things, it might be coming from that place of fear and feeling uncomfortable. And so, aging can already be incredibly isolating. I would even notice when I was helping somebody walking to and from the grocery store, right? It would be easy to compare and be like, oh, I wish I could walk as easily as you can. Like, you should be grateful that you can move as much as you can, right? So I think helping people focus on the things that they can do and the things that they can still enjoy, like how great is it that you get to spend time with your grandkids, right? How great is it that we can sit here and do this together? Like, I'm enjoying the time that I spend with you too, right? Because research shows that caregiving and aging relationships are often shaped by long-standing family dynamics, generational expectations, childhood experiences, and communication differences. And so there's just so many moving elements to all of this. And again, I am not saying that this means you should tolerate abuse. If this is an abusive situation, please find help in some way that you can. Whether that's finding respite care, maybe this is your job, so please speak up and try to find somebody else maybe that can handle this person, right? But I do think that understanding the emotional landscape that they are in can help us navigate these situations with more wisdom and just clarity on what is going on, right? But I also think that this is where boundaries matter a lot, because compassion without boundaries becomes burnout. And caregivers already experience incredibly high levels of emotional and physical strain. Research consistently shows that caregiving negatively impacts emotional well-being, stress levels, physical health, finances, and social connection. So if you are a caregiver navigating difficult interactions like this, please do not carry it alone. Please talk about it, process it, go to therapy if you need to, and just find your support system, because shoving it all deep down inside does not help anyone. And in a way, I think, that is something that we can learn from older generations, and when they didn't get to talk about their feelings as much and seeing the kind of pain and anguish that has caused people. I know I've seen that in my own family, that when people don't talk about things, it causes a lot of stress, right? But I think, again, one of the biggest things that being a caregiver taught me is that humans are complicated. People are rarely all good or all bad, and I think we would all be able to admit that we have our own dark things that we try to hide, right? And so sometimes the same person who says something hurtful is also deeply lonely. And sometimes the same person that's frustrating you is also terrified of what's going on. And sometimes caregiving just means somehow figuring out how to navigate all these different contradictions. And that is so exhausting. But it's part of what makes caregiving such a deeply emotional work and can be so fulfilling as you navigate these situations. So, to the younger caregivers listening, if you've ever felt guilty for struggling emotionally with this topic, I promise you are not alone. If you've ever cried after a difficult shift, that does not make you weak. If you've ever felt torn between compassion and then also trying to fix the situation, that just makes you human. And I think we need more space for conversations like this because it's not all beautiful moments, it's not all inspirational moments. Sometimes it's just really messy and complicated, and people don't always highlight the reality of that on social media, right? So I just wanted to say thank you for being here today, and thank you for being willing to take care of yourself just by listening to this and taking time to make space for this conversation. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you shared it with another caregiver who may need to hear that they're not alone in these feelings. And as always, from the first emergency to the identity crisis after loss, we are here for every step of caregiving. So I'll talk to you soon.